Hey everyone, welcome back to the deep dive. We get a lot of questions from you all, and one that keeps popping up is how to study more effectively, how to really remember what we read. So we thought, why not dive into that for this one?
And it's such a good question, right? We all want to learn and remember things better.
Exactly. So we've been digging through some research on this, and there's this really cool idea from a paper back in 1989 by Mark McDaniel and Gilles Einstein that we think is super relevant here.
Yeah, this paper is kind of a classic in the learning and memory world.
They called their idea a material appropriate processing approach, which sounds kind of jargony, but it's actually a really simple, powerful idea once you wrap your head around it.
It really challenges some of our assumptions about how learning works. We often think that if we just put in more time, more effort, we'll automatically remember things better.
Right, like if we just read something over and over enough times, it'll magically stick in our brains.
But McDaniel and Einstein were like, hold on a second, it's not that simple. It's not just about how much effort you put in. It's about how that effort aligns with the type of information you're trying to learn.
Like maybe the way you study for a history exam is totally different from how you'd study for, say, a vocabulary test or a coding course.
Exactly. So that's what this whole material appropriate processing idea is all about. It's about being strategic and matching your study strategies to the kind of stuff you're learning.
So for this deep dive, we're going to break this concept down for you, looking at where it came from, what the research says, and most importantly, what it means for you when you sit down to study. We want to help you find those aha moments where things really click, where you feel like you truly understand and will actually remember what you're learning without getting completely overwhelmed.
Okay, so let's rewind a bit and see what led McDaniel and Einstein to this whole material appropriate processing thing. They were looking at a bunch of studies on different learning and memory strategies, and they noticed this, well, kind of a frustrating pattern.
Yeah, it was like a puzzle they were trying to solve.
So you have all these learning techniques that people say are really effective, right?
Mm.
Like taking detailed notes, making outlines, trying to explain the material in your own words, asking yourself questions as you read.
The classic study tips, right?
Right. And sometimes these techniques did seem to work really well. But the weird thing was that they weren't always effective. Sometimes they didn't seem to make any difference at all, and sometimes they even seemed to make things worse. Like people actually remembered less when they used these supposedly helpful techniques.
That's so counterintuitive, right? You'd think if you're putting in more effort, it should at least help a little.
Exactly. And that's what got McDaniel and Einstein thinking, okay, there's something else going on here. They realized that how well a study technique works isn't just about the technique itself. It's also about the context, the situation, all these other factors that come into play.
So they called this a contextualist perspective.
Yeah, and what they mean by that is that how well you remember something, depending not only on the study technique you used, but also on things like what exactly you were doing while you were studying, the specific material you were trying to learn, how you were tested on it later, and even your own individual learning style and background knowledge.
Right, so it's like this big web of influences, and they were trying to untangle it.
Exactly. And for this deep dive, we're going to really zoom in on one of those key factors that they highlighted, the material itself. They're basically saying, hey, we need to pay a lot more attention to the characteristics of what we're trying to learn and how those characteristics interact with the way we're studying.
So it's not just about blindly applying the same study techniques to everything. It's about being more mindful and intentional about how we're engaging with the specific information in front of us.
And this brings us to the heart of their idea, the material appropriate processing, or MAP framework. What they're saying is that how well a study technique helps you remember something depends on how well it lines up with the kind of mental processing that's naturally encouraged by the material itself.
Okay, so let's break this down. What exactly do they mean by mental processing?
When we're talking about memory, processing basically refers to how we're working with information in our minds. It's about how we're thinking about it, organizing it, and connecting it to what we already know. And for trying to remember things without any hints, what they call free recall, they identify two key types of processing that are really important.
Okay, so two types of mental processing. What are they?
The first one is called individual item processing. This is all about focusing on the specific details and unique characteristics of each piece of information you're trying to learn. It's like really zeroing in on each individual fact or concept.
So like if you were studying a list of vocabulary words, you'd really focus on each word separately. maybe looking at its definition, its etymology, thinking of examples of how it's used.
Exactly. You're really trying to understand and remember each item on its own. Now, the second type of processing is called relational processing. This is where you shift your attention away from the individual details and start looking at the connections and relationships between those details. You're trying to understand how those different pieces of information get together.
So with the vocabulary list, instead of just looking at each word individually, you might start thinking about how some of the words are related to each other. Maybe they're synonyms, or they share a common root, or they all relate to a particular theme.
Precisely. You're building those mental connections, weaving those words into a larger web of meaning. Now, it's important to understand that both individual item and relational processing are generally helpful for remembering things. You need to know the specific details, and you also need to understand how those details relate to each other.
It's like you need to see both the trees and the forest.
Exactly. But the key insight from the MAP framework is that the effectiveness of a particular study strategy depends on which of these types of processing it encourages and how that lines up with what the material itself is already kind of nudging you towards.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it, but it would be helpful to see how this actually plays out. Where did McDaniel and Einstein find evidence for these different types of processing and how they interact with the material?
They actually looked at a lot of different studies, and one area they focus on was how people remember lists of words. There's a classic study from the 1980s by Einstein and Hunt where they had people study lists of words, and they manipulated whether people were encouraged to focus on the similarities between words, which would be relational processing, or the distinctive features of each word, which would be individual item processing.
And what did they find?
They found that both types of processing, focusing on similarities and focusing on distinctive features, help people remember the words better compared to just reading the list with no particular strategy. But what's really interesting is that they also found that the type of word list mattered.
How so?
Well, if the words in the list were already related to each other in some way, like if they were all different types of birds, for example, people naturally tended to engage in more relational processing, looking for those connections between the birds. In that case, a study strategy that pushed people to focus on the distinctive features of each bird was particularly effective. It was like providing a counterbalance to what their brains were already doing.
So if the material is already encouraging you to think relationally, then a study technique that pushes you towards individual item processing might be more beneficial.
Exactly. It's about providing that complementary type of processing. And on the flip side, if the word list was just a bunch of random unrelated words, then encouraging people to look for similarities actually helped them remember better because it was adding that relational element that was missing.
Makes sense. So it's not just about the strategy itself, it's about how that strategy interacts with the material. Did they find similar things when they looked at how people remember actual text, like stories and articles?
Yeah, they looked at a whole bunch of studies where researchers had people read different kinds of texts, and they used a variety of techniques to manipulate the type of processing people engaged in while they were reading. And a lot of those studies showed similar patterns to what they found with the word lists.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. One study had people read short stories, and they had one group of people read the story from the perspective of a particular character, which encouraged them to think about how different events in the story related to that character's thoughts and feelings. That's a form of relational processing, right? You're building those connections.
Right.
And then they had another group of people read the same stories, but they had to do a task where they had to fill in some missing letters in some of the words. That would force them to pay closer attention to the individual words and what they meant, which is more of an individual item processing task.
And what did they find?
They found that those two techniques, reading from a particular perspective and filling in missing letters, seemed to work together to boost memory. People remembered more when they did both of those things compared to just reading the story normally.
So it's like they were attacking the story from two different angles, reinforcing their memory in different ways.
Exactly. Another study used a confusing text about how to wash clothes, where it wasn't immediately obvious what the main point of the text was. They found that making the theme of the text really obvious, which would help people see how the different sentences were connected, improved memory. But again, they found that this was even more effective when it was combined with the missing letter task, that individual item processing piece.
Okay, so it's starting to sound like for most reading situations, you want to be engaging in both relational and individual item processing.
You got it. But they also found some intriguing differences between how these types of processing affected people's ability to recognize information versus recall it.
Can you explain that a bit more?
So recognition is when you're given a piece of information and you just have to say whether you've seen it before, like on a multiple choice test. Recall is when you have to actually pull the information out of your memory without any cues, like on an essay question. And what they found was that individual item processing seemed to be particularly helpful for recognition. Like if you really focus on the details of each word in a list, you'll be better at recognizing those specific words later. But for recall, relational processing was more important.
Because if you understand how the ideas are connected, it's easier to access those ideas when you're trying to remember them without any prompts.
Exactly. It's like you've built a stronger mental framework for the information so you can navigate it more easily.
So it's not just about whether you're focusing on individual details or connections, it also matters how you're going to be tested on the material.
Absolutely. And now we've talked about different study techniques and how they might encourage one type of processing or another. But what about just the inherent difficulty of the material itself? Sometimes we hear that making learning more difficult can actually be a good thing. Does that fit in with this framework at all?
Yeah, it seems kind of counterintuitive, right? Like, wouldn't making things harder just make it harder to remember?
Well, that's where this material appropriate processing idea gets even more interesting. McDaniel and Einstein argue that different ways of making learning harder, what they call encoding difficulty, can actually lead you to engage in either more individual item processing or more relational processing, depending on how you're making it harder. And the key is whether that extra effort, that extra difficulty, is pushing you towards a type of processing that complements what the material itself is already encouraging.
Okay, I need an example here. Can you give me a specific situation where making something harder to learn actually led to better memory?
Sure, there's this really cool study from 1986 by McDaniel and some of his colleagues, where they had people read either a fairy tale or a more factual, descriptive passage. But they made the reading task harder in two different ways.
Okay, how did they make it harder?
For one group, they took out a lot of the letters in the words, making it much harder to actually identify each individual word.
Wow, that sounds really annoying.
It was probably a little frustrating.
Huh.
But it forces you to really focus on each word, right?
Yeah, you really have to work to figure out what each word is.
Exactly. And for the other group, they mixed up the order of the sentences in the passages, so people had to mentally unscramble them to make sense of it.
So, taking out letters would make you focus more on the individual words, and scrambling the sentences would make you think more about how the ideas connect.
You got it. And they also had a control group that just read the texts normally.
And what happened? Did making the task harder actually help people remember the texts better?
Well, that's the really fascinating part. They found that taking out letters significantly improved how well people remembered the fairy tales, but it didn't really change how well they remembered the descriptive passages.
Huh, that's interesting.
But here's the twist. Scrambling the sentences dramatically improved memory for the descriptive passages, but it didn't do much for the fairy tales.
Wow, that's a huge difference. So the same technique, making the task harder, can have completely opposite effects depending on what you're trying to learn.
Precisely. And here's how they explain those results. They suggested that taking out letters, by making it harder to process each individual word, actually encouraged people to engage in more individual item processing. And this was really helpful for the fairy tales because they argued that fairy tales, with their familiar story structures and clear cause and effect relationships, already tend to encourage relational processing. So the letter deletion task was providing that missing piece, that individual item focus.
It's like adding that extra spice that was missing from the dish, making it more balanced.
Exactly. And the sentence scrambling task, by forcing people to actively reconstruct the order of the sentences, was encouraging them to engage in more relational processing. And this was really helpful for the descriptive passages because they often focus more on individual facts and details and might not have a very obvious inherent structure. So the sentence scrambling was forcing people to look for those connections that weren't immediately apparent.
So making learning harder isn't a magic bullet. It really depends on how you're making it harder and what kind of material you're dealing with.
Exactly. And this leads us to another key idea from McDaniel and Einstein, which is that different types of materials have what they call differential affordances, meaning they naturally encourage different ways of processing information.
Okay, can you unpack that a bit for me? What does it mean to say that a material affords a certain type of processing?
Think about it like this. Different tools are designed for different purposes, right? A hammer is good for pounding nails. A screwdriver is good for turning screws. They afford different actions because of how they're shaped and what they're made of. Similarly, different types of text, different types of information kind of invite you to think about them in certain ways because of how they're structured, the kind of language they use, the kind of information they contain.
So a fairy tale kind of nudges you towards relational processing because it has a plot, characters, a clear sequence of events.
That's the general idea. They suggest that narratives, like fairy tales with their familiar structures and clear cause and effect chains, tend to naturally pull you into thinking about how the events are connected and how they relate to each other. You're automatically trying to follow the flow of the story.
Whereas a more factual text, like a scientific article or a historical account, might naturally lead you to focus more on the specific details and facts being presented without necessarily emphasizing those big picture connections.
Precisely.
Hmm.
And there's some research that supports this. For instance, some studies have shown that when people read difficult factual text, they tend to spend more time and mental effort trying to understand each individual word.
Like really trying to unpack the meaning of each sentence.
Exactly. And other studies have looked at how people's eyes move when they're reading, and they've found that when readers go back and reread parts of a text, they're more likely to look back at specific details in factual texts, but focus on the main ideas when they reread stories.
So the way our eyes move even reflects the kind of processing that's being encouraged by the material.
It seems that way. So all of this really points to the central principle of the MAP framework, which is that you get the best results when your study strategy encourages a type of processing that complements what the material is already inviting you to do.
It's about finding that balance, that sweet spot where you're adding something new and valuable to the way you're engaging with the information.
Exactly. And if you're just doing more of the same type of processing, it's like you're spinning your wheels, you're putting in the effort, but it's not really translating into better memory because you're not adding anything new to the mix.
So how can we actually apply this MAP framework in real-world learning situations? Did McDaniel and Einstein give any specific examples of how to do that?
Yes, they actually explored several applications of their framework. One area they looked at was this idea of critical confusion as a teaching method. Now, this idea actually goes back to the late 1970s with a researcher named Donald Norman. He suggested that sometimes deliberately making things a little bit confusing for students could actually help them learn better.
Really? How does that work? Wouldn't confusion just make things harder to understand?
Well, Norman's idea was that if information is presented too clearly, students might just passively absorb it without really engaging with it deeply. But if they encounter some targeted confusion, some sort of roadblock, it forces them to stop, think, and actively work to resolve that confusion.
It's like that saying, smooth as seas don't make skillful sailors.
Exactly. And McDaniel and Einstein saw their techniques for making text harder to read, like taking out letters and scrambling sentences, as examples of this critical confusion in action.
Because those techniques force you to really think about the material, right? You can't just passively skim over it.
Precisely. But their findings added a really important caveat to this idea of critical confusion. They showed that just any kind of confusion isn't necessarily helpful. It really only seems to improve memory when it leads to the kind of processing that's appropriate for the material.
So scrambling sentences might be a helpful kind of confusion for a factual text, where you need to figure out how the ideas are connected, but it might just be frustrating and unhelpful for a story where you're naturally trying to follow the plot.
Exactly. And they even looked at how much confusion was helpful. They did studies where they varied the percentage of letters they removed from the words or how much they scrambled the sentences. And what they found was that there seems to be a sweet spot. If you make it too easy, people might not engage deeply enough. But if you make it too difficult, they might just get overwhelmed and give up. It's about finding that optimal level of challenge that pushes people to think actively without making them completely lost.
It's like that Goldilocks zone of learning. Not too hard, not too soft, just right.
Exactly. Another really important question, especially if you're trying to learn something for the long haul, is whether this material-appropriate processing idea holds up over time. Does it just help you remember things in the short term, or does it actually lead to better long-term memory?
Yeah, that's what really matters, right? If you're studying for an exam, you might just need to cram information into your short-term memory. But if you're trying to learn something for life, you need it to stick around.
Right. So to address this quotient, McDaniel and Einstein did studies where they had people try to remember the texts either immediately after reading them or a week later.
And what did they find? Did the effects of material appropriate processing last?
Well, they found some interesting results. They found that unscrambling sentences, which we talked about earlier as a way to encourage relational processing, was helpful for remembering the factual passages, both immediately and a week later.
So, focusing on the relationships between ideas seems to be good for both short term and long term memory when you're dealing with that kind of factual information.
Right. But what's really intriguing is that they also found that sentence unscrambling actually helped people remember the fairy tales better a week later, even though fairy tales already tend to encourage relational processing because of their narrative structure.
That's really unexpected. Why would focusing on relationships become even more important for remembering fairy tales over time?
It's a good question. And it suggests that maybe this focus on relationships and the overall structure of the information becomes particularly crucial for long-term memory, no matter what kind of material you're dealing with initially. It's like you're building a stronger foundation, a more stable mental model that you can more easily access and retrieve later on.
It's like if you have a well organized filing system, it's easier to find what you're looking for, even months or years later.
Exactly. And on the flip side, they found that taking out letters, which encourages individual item processing, only helped with fairy tales in the short term and didn't show any long-term benefits for either type of passage. So it seems like that kind of detail focus might be helpful for remembering things quickly, but maybe not so much for really solidifying those memories over time.
So, for information to really stick with us, focusing on those big picture connections, that relational processing, might be especially important, even for things that already have a strong narrative structure.
It seems that way. Now, beyond looking at these techniques for making text harder to read, McDaniel and Einstein also explored how their MAP framework could help us understand the effectiveness of some more traditional pedagogical techniques, the kind of things teachers use in classrooms and students use when they're studying.
Like what kinds of techniques?
Well, one technique they looked at was embedded questions, which are questions that are placed within the text as you're reading.
Oh, yeah, I remember those from textbooks. They're usually at the end of a section or a chapter.
Right, and they can be really helpful, but McDaniel and Einstein's idea was that these kinds of questions, especially when they're asking about specific information that was just presented, tend to push readers towards individual item processing. You're really focusing on finding the answer to that specific question on those individual details.
And based on the MAP framework, what would you expect about how well embedded questions would work with different types of texts?
Well, if embedded questions are pushing you towards individual item processing, then they should be particularly helpful for texts that naturally encourage relational processing, like fairy tales, because they'd be providing that complementary type of thinking.
So it's like those questions are forcing you to slow down and pay attention to the details that you might otherwise just skim over while you're caught up in the flow of the story.
Precisely. And that's exactly what they found. In their study, embedded questions significantly improved memory for the fairy tales, but they didn't really help with the factual passages.
So even something as common and seemingly helpful as asking questions can actually be more or less effective depending on the material you're learning.
Right, which again highlights the importance of being mindful and intentional about the study strategies you're using. Another common technique they looked at was outlining, which a lot of students use to try and organize information and make it more manageable.
Yeah, I used to make outlines all the time in school. It helps you see the big picture. Like,
Exactly. And that's why McDaniel and Einstein saw outlining as a technique that primarily encourages relational processing. You're identifying the main points, figuring out how they're connected, creating a hierarchy of information.
so if outlining is all about seeing those relationships, then the MAP framework would predict that it would be most helpful for texts that tend to encourage individual item processing, like those factual descriptive passages.
Right, because it would be adding that missing relational element. And that's exactly what they found. In their study, outlining significantly improved memory for the descriptive passages, but it didn't really boost memory for the fairy tales, which already had a strong relational structure.
It's all about finding that balance, that complementary type of processing.
Exactly. And they even extended this framework to look at the use of pictures alongside text, what they called adjunct pictures. They distinguished between pictures that focus on specific details from the text and pictures that tried to show the relationships between different parts of the text.
Interesting. So, like a picture of a specific object mentioned in the text versus a diagram showing how different concepts are connected.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
And they wanted to see how those different kinds of pictures interacted with different types of text.
And what did they find?
Well, this is where the findings got a little bit more nuanced. In their initial study, they actually found that the pictures seemed to be enhancing the type of processing that the text was already encouraging, rather than providing that complementary processing.
Can you explain that a bit more? What do you mean by enhancing rather than complementing?
So, for example, they found that pictures showing specific details help people remember details in the factual text, and pictures showing relationships help people remember the connections in the fairy tales. It was like the pictures were just reinforcing what the text was already doing, rather than adding a new dimension of processing.
That's interesting. Why do you think that was the case? Why were the pictures different from the other techniques, like the letter deletion and sentence scrambling?
Well, they thought it might be because, unlike actively doing something like outlining or answering embedded questions, just looking at pictures might not be enough to really force people to process the text in a different way.
Uh,
Maybe people weren't really engaging with the pictures deeply enough to make them shift their thinking.
It's like if you just glance at a picture, you might not really take it in, but if you have to draw it yourself or describe it to someone, you have to engage with it on a deeper level.
Right. So in a follow-up study, they actually gave people specific instructions to try and encourage that complementary processing.
What kind of instructions?
Like if they were reading a factual passage, they were told to really focus on the relationships between the things shown in the picture, even if those relationships weren't explicitly spelled out in the text. And if they were reading a fairy tale, they were told to really focus on the specific details in the picture, even though the fairy tale was already encouraging them to think about the overall story.
And did those instructions make a difference?
They did see some evidence that those complementary effects could emerge, although the original reinforcing effects were still there too. So it seems like it might be a little harder for us to naturally engage in a type of processing that the material itself isn't really inviting, even if we're told to do it. It's like our brains have a certain way of approaching different kinds of information, and it takes a bit more effort to break out of that mold.
So it's not impossible to override our natural tendencies, but it might take a bit more conscious effort.
Exactly. Finally, McDaniel and Einstein briefly touched on how prior knowledge, what you already know about a topic, might play into this whole material-appropriate processing idea. They hypothesized that people who already know a lot about a topic might naturally engage in more relational processing, even with texts that wouldn't necessarily encourage that for someone who's less familiar with the topic.
Makes sense. If you already have a mental framework for a topic, you're more likely to see how new information fits into that framework, right?
Right. So to test this idea, they used a passage about a fictional baseball game, and they had people who knew a lot about baseball and people who knew very little about baseball read the passage. And then, as in previous studies, they manipulated the text in a couple of different ways.
They took out letters and scrambled sentences.
Exactly. And, as you might expect, the people who knew a lot about baseball remembered more of the passage overall, regardless of how the text was presented. And they found that for the people who didn't know much about baseball, scrambling the sentences actually helped them remember more, which fits the idea that it was helping them build those connections that weren't immediately obvious to them.
And for the baseball experts, taking out letters helped them remember more, which you'd expect if it was pushing them towards individual item processing, complementing their already strong relational processing.
Exactly. But here's where it gets interesting again. They also found that scrambling the sentences helped the baseball experts remember more, which wasn't what they were expecting.
Another curveball. Why do you think that was the case?
Well, they went back and looked at the baseball passage, and they realized that even for people who know a lot about baseball, the specific events in their fictional game might not have actually had a very strong inherent cause and effect structure. Like one thing happening didn't necessarily lead logically to the next thing happening based on typical baseball strategy.
So even the experts might not have been naturally engaging in as much relational processing as they initially thought.
Right. It seems like even if you're familiar with a topic, the way the information is presented can still influence how you process it.
So it's not just about what you bring to the table, it's also about what the material itself is doing.
Exactly. And this led them to think more broadly about the idea of causal structure in texts. They suggested that stories often have clearer causal chains than many factual texts, which might be one reason why stories tend to encourage more relational processing. And they're actually doing more research now, modifying the baseball passage to have more explicit cause and effect connections to see how that affects people's memory.
Really fascinating stuff. This whole MAP framework is so insightful, it really changes how you think about learning. It's not just about putting in the hours, it's about being strategic, about really understanding the material you're working with and choosing study methods that complement its natural affordances.
Absolutely. And while most of their research is focused on free recall and on relatively short pieces of text, they do point out that this is really just the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more to explore, like how this framework applies to different types of test questions, like recognition and application, and to longer, more complex materials, like textbook chapters. They also acknowledge that different kinds of factual writing might naturally encourage different kinds of processing, which would have implications for which study methods are most effective.
It's like they've opened up this whole new way of thinking about learning, and there are so many paths to explore.
Exactly. So just to bring it all back to you listening, the key takeaway here is that truly effective learning isn't just about effort, it's about alignment. It's about making sure that the way you're studying is a good match for the kind of information you're trying to learn.
So the next time you sit down to study, take a moment to really think about the material in front of you. Is it a story with a clear plot and characters? Is it a historical account with a lot of dates and names? Is it a scientific article explaining a complex process? Once you have a sense of what kind of material it is, try to choose study techniques that encourage the opposite type of thinking to deepen your understanding and memory.
If it's a narrative, maybe spend some time really focusing on the specific details, on the individual events and characters. If it's a factual text, maybe try to create a visual representation of how the ideas are connected, like a mind map or a concept map.
Experiment with different approaches, see what works best for you and for different types of materials. And here's a final thought to leave you with. What are the implications of this material appropriate processing idea for how we teach and how educational materials are designed? Could understanding these principles lead to more effective and personalized learning experiences for everyone?
And beyond just stories and factual texts, what about other kinds of materials? What about things like music or art or code? Do they also encourage specific types of processing? This deep dive is really just the beginning of a much larger and incredibly important conversation about how we all learn best.
Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. We'll see you next time.